Hey, welcome back to the show. You know, some of the protesters at the Occupy movements, both in Toronto, around Canada, and even in the States, wear a mask that's a stylized mask of a funny face and a mustache. And I'm not sure if they know who it is that they're wearing, but a friend of mine, Chris Sims from our Ottawa bureau, who traveled to the Occupy Toronto protests over the weekend, has done some deep digging into the mask. And you're going to tell us, and I think you're going to educate a lot of the protesters, because I found them to be pretty clueless about things. So if any of them are watching, I think they're going to learn something from you. Chris Sims, take it away.
Well, I hope so. As you said, the masks are becoming increasingly popular at these movements. And I'll just say one of the first people I approached and tried to speak with at the Occupy Toronto protest on Saturday was a woman in a big camo coat, and she was wearing one of these Guy Fawkes masks, as they're being referred to as, and holding a great big orange 9/11 truth sign. I tried to speak to her. She refused. She stayed mute. And then I moved on to another person quite a ways away from her, also wearing a mask, to talk to him. And she ran over, went, like, don't talk to this person. So I said, hey, come on, I thought this was a free and open protest with no leaders. So she backed off. The thing about these masks is they're described as the Guy Fawkes mask because it's a characterization of the face we expected to have belonged to Guy Fawkes, who famously was in charge of the gunpowder under the British Parliament and was convicted of trying to blow up the British Parliament and murder the British King back in, I think, the 1600s. And so this mask was then adopted by a very recent graphic novel by Alan Moore. It's called V for Vendetta. It's what you see on the front cover of this book. I've read most of the book, haven't seen the movie, so please forgive my ignorance there. But in V for Vendetta, from as far as I can gather, this guy is trying to undermine a totalitarian state, which is run by, you know, rabid right-wingers. In fact, it's a group called the Norse Fire who have taken over and are rounding people into camps and killing them off. And this guy is the sadist/hero of the book, and at one point he actually uses, of all things, water torture on a woman in order to make her realize, you know, the truth of her existence. So the guy's a real nasty piece of work, frankly, and I've read lots of comic books. This guy's frankly a jerk throughout much of the graphic novel, and so it's kind of strange to see these folk wearing this mask. I understand if some of them want to be anonymous for their own motivations, and I think it's kind of taken on a very cool thing. I don't think a lot of them know either the Guy Fawkes reference or the V for Vendetta reference.
Yeah, you know, I don't think either. I mean, I think you're right that these folks probably saw the movie V for Vendetta. I saw the movie, and it's an ultra-violent vigilante killing people in the name of fighting against the government. Ironically, a lot of these protesters want more government, but either that is their hero, or if they go back to the original Guy Fawkes, well, let me tell you a little bit about it, Chris. You're so right. He was behind the gunpowder plot that was underneath the British House of Commons in 1605. He had rented sort of a croft, or like an attic, and he had packed it with gunpowder, and he hid it behind some firewood. And when the king and parliament were assembled, he was going to blow up the entire parliament. And recently the BBC did a recreation of that, what would happen if that much gunpowder went off. It would have killed every single member of parliament and the royal court. It would have basically decapitated the government in England. So this is the great hero of these protesters, a would-be assassin, mass murderer, and traitor. Of course, just a little historical detail, the reason Guy Fawkes was caught is that someone in his clan wrote an anonymous warning letter to a couple of friends who were going to be in Parliament that day, saying, you'd better get out of there, bad things are going to come. So their own stupidity tipped off the government. Otherwise history would have been different. But my point is, I'm not quite sure if that is a role model for anyone who cares about democracy or free speech or nonviolent solutions to problems.
You'd think, right? And I actually asked the guy who wouldn't take off his mask but who did speak to me. He was actually, if you can believe it or not, one of the more skilled people there. He said he was a cabinet maker and a finisher, and he was just worried about being identified. I said, dude, like, this person in the graphic novel, let alone Guy Fawkes, the person in the graphic novel tortures this woman, like manipulates her for years and years. She's so starving you can see her sternum, and in fact it's water torture. Imagine Amnesty International going after this guy and, you know, charging him with war crimes, right? And he said, yeah, but he was torturing for the right reasons.
You know what, though? I think there's something really creepy about adults going out in political events covering their face. I mean, if it's Halloween, yeah, maybe, although I think adults who dress up for Halloween give me the creeps. But I think there's something wrong about grown men hiding their identity in public, because it tells me they're up to mischief. And if it's not a kerchief or a mask, it's this Guy Fawkes mask. I find it deeply troubling.
Well, a lot of people share your view, and in fact, this issue has been raised several times, both at protests and the ongoing debate over the niqab, for example. People say that it breaks the social contract to not be able to see someone's face in order to read their emotions, their intentions, some of their thoughts, that sort of thing. So I can understand your concern. I was also surprised that, there were folks, right alongside these people who are either wearing a mask which characterizes either, a guy who is, fighting a totalitarian regime who is rounding up people by the thousands and having them killed. Do they think that's what's happening here in Canada? Do they think that they're fighting over some sort of, all-encompassing totalitarian regime which must be undermined at all costs? Or do they fancy Guy Fawkes? And they're standing right next to people who are also holding signs openly with no masks calling for revolution, smashing the state, taking over the state, revolution in order to take over Parliament. And some of these people unabashedly, I'd ask them, so what happens if you get up onto Parliament Hill and they roll the tanks out after you because you're trying to topple government? And this guy said, well, hopefully by then society will have crumbled to the point where their spirit is broken within the armed forces and they just won't have the ability to fight back.
Kris Sims, I'm glad you're fighting back on our side. That is the side of law and order and democracy. Appreciate you joining us today.
You're welcome.
Hey,